People generally like characters who are encouraging and affectionate towards their character. It's been a factor with other fan favorites such as Haurchefant, and likely why selling Venat to the audience took the route it did. Many only cared how Venat treated the player, and weren't concerned with how she treated anyone else. Another tactic used to endear the player to Venat was tying her motives to you, which is something else shown to be successful with other characters. Much of the love for Graha stems from the reveal his driving motivation was you. Likewise, much of the intrigue for Emmett was based on his personal stake regarding you as someone he knew in the past. The writers likely took note of this formula and presumed people would love Venat if she had also been doing everything for them. Within that context, the Sundering becomes sort of a touching if tragic gesture which seems to have worked for a lot of people. I can admit, Venat was charming in Elpis, and many of my issues aren't with her, but with the writing. I got the impression I was not meant to analyze her actions critically or view her as morally complicated. The writers decided in advance how they wanted players to think of Hydaelyn and put aside any complexity in the matter. All of the emotions surrounding her is an attempt to get you to feel for her without thinking about any conflict in her character. You're meant to see her as a savior, a maternal figure, and to love her as such. As a player, you're only given one dialogue choice at the beginning of the expansion to express disapproval of her. Once you learn the full story, the Warrior of Light is shoehorned into thinking she's as wonderful as everyone else does. We're clearly intended to view Venat as unambiguously right and good. No character given any credence speaks against her, and her framing is relentlessly favorable and affirming of her perspective. When contrasted with her actions, this creates an uncomfortable dissonance. This is a stark difference from how Grey characters are written, and is not a treatment any other character who is intended to be read as morally complicated gets, such as Ysayle, Regula, Yotsuyu, Emmett, or Elidibus. Venat's statement that the Sundering was unjust and unkind, noting she never once expresses guilt or regret in doing so, does not offset the universal zeal in which she's regarded by the characters, player responses, quest log, short story, or minion and codex descriptions, all of which are unabashed in positivity towards her at all occasions. Characters can be biased, but when the game itself is characterizing her thus, it seems evident what I'm seeing is the perspective of the writers, and rather than giving me a choice in what to believe, they're telling me. I may have found her more compelling if she had been left to be what she is, a charismatic yet self-righteous ideologue with a deluge of blood on her hands. I can only assume the writers were worried doing so would leave a bad taste in players' mouths, having been lied to and manipulated for the past 10 years by someone they may have considered a supportive figure to the Warrior of Light. Omega Beyond the Rift is the only time Venat is addressed with any nuance, which hasn't carried over to any other part of the game thus far, least of all the MSQ. Omega points out the irreparable damage she did to mankind, noting the full scale of which is beyond calculation. It is then posited if survival is the deciding factor, then you should also admire Hermes, framing Venat's beliefs and actions as being no different than his. The comparison is extended to include the Omicrons, a race of beings who forced themselves to evolve through ruthless and vicious means. It changed the way we're pushed to understand Venat's position by associating her with others who did horrific things in pursuit of what they believed. As mentioned earlier, the Sage job quests include an antagonist whose explicit aim is to force evolution on his subjects, and the game is clear in presenting this as a villainous act to be opposed. During the Pandemonium quest at Keyward's jail, La Habrea comments in regards to Venat, the previous Asm was much the same, and taking the entirety of the star into consideration, she came to hold dear emotions and people that a more logical mind would have discarded. This made her act in her own self-interest more often than not. This is the most direct acknowledgement we get that Venat was somewhat of a dissident even when acting in an official capacity. While we're in Elpis, Emmett tells us after the meeting with Hermes, it is held that all civil organizations should conduct their affairs with total transparency, and the Convocation is no exception. Later, Hythlodaeus tells us, "You needn't be nervous around Venat. Those white robes mark her as one of fair and impartial reasoning." Venat doesn't show she believes society's rules apply to her. She subverts the convocation, circumvents the institutions intended for debate, and overturns the will of the people in order to enact her own will. I often read Hermes as a tale of the importance of peer review, while Venat similarly violates every procedure, acting in direct opposition to transparency, impartiality, or fairness. Venat lies to everyone, with abandon, to further her own goals. She lied about the origins of Hydaelyn and Zodiark, about how much power she had and what she's capable of accomplishing with that power. She lied by omission, allowing Hermes' false narrative after Kairos to stand. She lied to her own followers, both to mislead the convocation, the populace at large, and to manipulate them into sacrificing their souls to her. Based on how events unfolded following Alpus, everything she said to the Warrior of Light prior to their departure was a lie, as there's no evidence she tried to mitigate the impact of the final days, or that she ever trusted anyone with the truth. As noted earlier, when addressing her many excuses, she also contradicts herself, switching from many remaining content upon learning of the dead ends to the situation spiraling out of control. Venat as a benevolent force falls apart the moment you have to answer, did she attempt to warn people about Medion? The short story, A Friendship of Record, confirms she didn't even tell her own followers, which is both unethical and disrespectful of their agency. Had they known the cause of the final days, or the consequences of the Sundering, they may have felt differently about sacrificing their souls to advance her goals. All they're presented with is an abstracted ideology of not living in the past, with the Zodiark as the boogeyman for hindering mankind's progress.
Genocide has ever been the Empire's favored recourse, and that is why we will continue to oppose your every attempt to claim Eorzea.
The Sundering is an effectively genocidal act. In order to feel it was a reasonable solution, it needed to be shown unequivocally there was no other alternative. Otherwise, Venat comes across as monstrous and impossible to sympathize with, even though based on the tone, we're not meant to see her that way, since the writers continue to try to gloss over the moral dissonance with vague positivity. As an aside, Hydaelyn didn't create any of the modern races except for the Loperites. They are either sundered ancients, the new life Zodiark seeded, or alien species. She made mankind only in the sense that someone who slices a cake made the cake. It not only doesn't establish an intrinsic maternal relationship, I would be mortified to discover my soul had been purposely split apart, and skeptical at a minimum of the person responsible. I've never understood why more people weren't bothered by what Venat did to Azim, especially as they're supposed to be the player insert in the unsundered world, and the fact they didn't join her doesn't speak to the veracity of her cause. It also wouldn't be unfair for the Sundered to take issue with what she's done. People are capable of recognizing awful deeds from the past served to put them where they are now. Venat's level of importance far exceeds any other character in 14, since every decision she made is fundamental to the setting. However, a line was crossed, and the sheer atrocity she committed, the story's apologism of it, and how foundational it is to the lore. Given how deeply tied to everything she is, if you feel dissonant with the perspective the story takes on her, it can be game-breaking. As an antagonistic force, she would have been similar to Emmett, someone who believed their course of action was for the best, no matter the cost. It's how she's already portrayed in the narrative, except unlike Emmett, she faces no backlash.